After being exposed by Cyan and placed under a spell, Kellen, one of Asal's subordinates, has now switched allegiance to Cyan. Following Cyan's orders, Kellen returns to report everything he knows about the recent tailing mission. Upon hearing the report, Asal contemplatively asks, "So, you think some unknown force is supporting my brother?" Kellen bows his head and calmly replies, "That's right. I believe the informants we sent were eliminated by them too." Asal looks up at him, frowning slightly, and asks, "Is that all?" Kellen calmly replies, "Yes, I apologize for the lack of information." Despite Cyan's order for him to reveal everything, Kellen genuinely doesn't know much more. However, it is Kellen's unusually calm demeanor that captures Asal's attention. Asal thinks, strange. This guy usually loses his composure and gets anxious easily, but the person standing before me now is very composed and quite different from usual. He wonders, I don't see the sense of desperation that Kellen had before leaving. It's as if he's a completely different person. Maintaining his calm exterior and concealing any suspicion, Asal bows his head and says, "I see." Then Kellen, "I would like to ask you a question." Hearing this, Kellen starts and freezes. He looks up immediately, meeting Asal's cold, scrutinizing gaze. Without a word, Kellen realizes the situation instantly. He frowns slightly, revealing a hint of worry, and thinks, this is a test. He's starting to doubt me. Kellen immediately punches his chest and bows deeply before Asal, solemnly reciting his usual slogan, "Let the blessing of Luminal be with you." Asal leisurely smirks and replies calmly, "I appreciate that response, Sir Kellen." He only wanted to check if the Kellen before him was genuine. Seeing Kellen's nervousness and cold sweat, Asal says slowly, "Don't take this the wrong way. It's just a kind of regular ritual. You're excused." Kellen turns to leave, still in a state of alertness. He is lost in confused thoughts. I better be careful. Once his doubts fully bloom, I won't be able to get out of this. As he opens the door, deep in thought, he is startled to find someone standing right behind it. Shocked, he thinks, this woman. She's young Master Cyan's maid, Emily. Emily, who was about to knock, smiles awkwardly upon seeing Kellen and says, "Hello?" Kellen frowns suspiciously and asks her, "What brings you here?" At that moment, Asal steps up, pats his shoulder, and says, "I called her." He smiles at Cyan's maid and asks, "Did you say your name is Emily?" She hurriedly stammers, "Why yes, young master." Asal smiles, though his smile appears forced, and asks kindly, "Could you do me a favor?" Seeing his smile, Emily blushes shyly and asks, "A favor?" Meanwhile, at the dragon lair, high-ranking dragons gather for an urgent meeting. Upon realizing that two of their own, both high-ranking dragons, have gone missing, the head dragon exclaims in shock, "Mr. Lucian and Miss Catalina are missing." The other dragons huddle behind the small Mona stones, gathering around the massive Mona stone of the leader dragon. They explain, they manifested divine powers at the outskirts of Luwin, but that's the last trace we have of them. The thing is, they were both above 8-star level. As you can see, their Mona stones have shattered. These destructive traces are all that remain from the battle. The dragons look at the two shattered Mona stones of Lucian and Catalina, which indicate that the dragons within them are dead. One dragon questions, "So, you mean the one who killed them erased all other evidence with magic?" Another dragon adds, "For that to be possible." The high-ranking dragon interrupts solemnly, "It would most likely need to be someone with dark elemental powers. The only one capable of killing those two is Kundal Quazel." However, the dragon hesitates. He does not possess dark elemental powers. In other words, there is some unknown fourth individual. Another dragon suddenly speaks up, "We are aware of a boy named Cyanvert, the only dark element user in the Royal Academy." A dragon recalls an earlier event. When Cyan faced a dark dragon on the battlefield, he nearly killed it, though it managed to escape. There are also rumors that he survived an attack from the Devil Dragon on the front lines. Perhaps he has something to do with the deaths of Renald Crimson and Zitraman Albus. They both worked with us to bring testing subjects and materials. The leader dragon listens silently, then skeptically says, "Is there some kind of connection between these events? I will need to keep an eye on this." Then, the leader dragon remembers its granddaughter, who is around Cyan's age, and immediately suggests, Luna of Rainreaver, have my granddaughter get acquainted with Cyan Vert. A new day dawned with sunlight streaming into the Royal Academy and the royal dorms. Princess Erin joyfully ran to Cyan's dorm room, carrying a delicious cake. She excitedly exclaimed, "Ta-da! A special cake made by the palace chefs." She had the cake made for little Nana and affectionately asked, "Enjoy it, Nana." Seeing the fragrant cake, Nana's eyes sparkled with excitement as she drooled, eagerly praising, "Whoa, I like you." The princess not only brought a cake, but also pulled a cart loaded with boxes of cakes. She gently said to Nana, "Have as much as you want. There's still a lot more." Nana stared wide-eyed at the cart full of delicious food. Cyan sat silently in a corner, watching the scene. Contentedly, he thought, they're having fun. We need to stay on the down low for a while. If the dragons were to sense Nana's presence, they might ambush us again. I will make sure that no one can put a hand on the people I care about. After all, I've decided to live purely for my own sake in this life. The sinister face and evil smile of Asal appeared in his mind. Cyan had a goal for this life. I'm going to completely ruin that bastard's plans. The princess suddenly turned to look at Cyan, surprised to see his expression. He was smiling delightfully, lost in thought, seemingly imagining something interesting. She curiously asked, "Cyan, did something good happen? You look happy." Cyan leisurely replied, I just had a nice thought." At the Vert residence garden, Asal was welcoming an esteemed guest. He warmly said, "It's been a while since I last saw you." His guest was Lionel Severus, the first prince. The prince slightly smirked and politely remarked, "You look like you're doing well, Asal." Asal politely smiled and flattered, "It's all thanks to you, your majesty." However, the first prince seemed preoccupied with something else. He glanced down and muttered, "More importantly, how long do you intend on rotting in this estate in the middle of nowhere? I heard that Alice has left on a journey." Asal didn't seem concerned about his sister. He calmly responded, "I'm actually worried about her. I don't know what she's doing or where she is." The first prince interrupted, "Worried about her?" He leaned on his hand, looked at Asal with a smirk, and said, "Aren't you actually worried that she might threaten your position of power?" Asal squinted at the prince, feigning innocence. "That's not something we should speak of." Prince then said, "We're friends, though. What can we say to each other?" A subordinate approached to pour wine for the prince. Ignoring the question, the prince slowly asked again, "Also, was your younger brother's name Cyan?" He looked at the glass of wine in his hand, gradually being filled, and calmly announced, "My father is interested in him, to the point that he seems to be considering an engagement between him and Erin." Mentioning his sister, the first prince suddenly felt a discomfort in his heart. He grimaced and resentfully exclaimed, "I don't know why he's so adamant about protecting his useless little garbage daughter." Asal leisurely smiled and glanced at the first prince with a calculating look, confidently affirming, "Don't feel rushed. The more attention she receives and the more power she gains, the more useful she will be to us." The first prince seemed satisfied with his answer and smirked appreciatively. "I like that you get how I feel." The prince's subordinate suddenly pointed the wine bottle towards Asal and asked, "Will you have some, sir?" Asal looked up at the subordinate and unexpectedly exclaimed, "I haven't seen this guardian knight before." The prince realized Asal was curious about his subordinate and turned to look at the knight beside him. He proudly introduced, Right? He's a jewel that I found while scouting the slums." This seemed to pique Asal's curiosity and interest. He glanced at the subordinate eagerly and asked, "Oh, you found the most exquisite of jewels?" The subordinate smiled at the compliment and introduced himself. "My name is Borislelm. Nice to meet you, sir." Boris's smile carried a sinister, dark aura. Fate had repeated itself. He had been Asal's most capable assistant in a previous life. 2 years passed, and at the academy, students turned their heads to look at the person striding across the yard. Over time, Cyan had somewhat concealed himself and gradually adapted to life at the academy. By now, his sister Alice had returned, and her presence caused all the male students at the academy to turn their heads in admiration. Alice glanced at a boy who had just been tapped on the head by his girlfriend for daring to glance at another girl. She smiled awkwardly and headed straight to the principal's office. The academy remained peaceful and calm that day. Alice knocked on the principal's door and naturally walked in. Principal Kundal seemed relieved to see her and greeted her politely. "It's been a while." Alice laughed, and he asked with concern, "So, did you enjoy your travels?" Alice nodded and replied, "Yes, I visited Frunia." Principal Kundal seemed surprised by her answer. He exclaimed, "Frunia? That's not a place where a human would have been welcomed." Alice set down her backpack, approached him, and replied, "You're right. It took me a year to adjust, but I really wanted to find the meaning of harmony you mentioned. Since you said that place would hold me back from growing, I needed to think of where I belong." Hearing her affirmation, Principal Kundal became contemplative. He frowned slightly and asked, "You seem to have made up your mind." Alice looked at him resolutely and declared, "Yes, I'm going to join the Knights of Light." Kundal hesitantly asked, "You're going to continue on with the will of your family?" Alice confidently looked at the principal, her eyes full of determination, and replied, "Well, someone had to take on the duty. I'm worried about my younger siblings too, especially Cyan. He's so shy." Hearing this, Principal Kundal suddenly burst out laughing. Alice was stunned by his reaction and asked in confusion, "Why are you laughing?" He looked at Alice, slowly stroking his beard, raised an eyebrow slightly, and asked, "Cyan? Shy? How amusing." At that moment, Cyan unexpectedly walked into the room, half-jokingly saying, "Amusing? You're being too harsh, sir." Hearing her brother's voice, Alice turned around, startled. She was extremely surprised when she saw him and exclaimed, "Cyan?" Right in front of her, Cyan had grown to the point of being almost unrecognizable. He looked stronger and taller than the last time she remembered, making her pause for a moment and look at him skeptically. He calmly smiled, looked at his sister gently, and softly said, "I missed you, sister." After reuniting with Alice at the academy after many years apart, Cyan and his sister strolled together under the academy's courtyard, chatting merrily. Alice exclaimed in surprise, "You've changed quite a bit, Cyan." The boy who had been small and frail before she left now stood as tall as Alice. His body had grown more robust and mature. She raised her hand to compare their heights, murmuring, "You're the same height as me now. You're going to be taller than me soon?" Cyan glanced at his sister and laughed teasingly. "Do you think that maybe it's you that shrank and not me?" Alice, pouting, pinched Cyan's cheek and replied with a wry smile, "All right, stop right there." This joyful moment made him nostalgically recall the 2nd of July, year 988. "I remember this day in my past life too," he thought. He looked at his sister's radiant smile and thought uneasily, "It was the last day I saw my sister alive." Alice, showing concern, asked, "Aren't you going to go home? It's summer break." Cyan smiled sadly and answered, "No one other than you would welcome me there." Alice, visibly surprised by his response, widened her eyes and asked worriedly, "No one? Is that why you haven't gone home for 2 years?" Cyan lowered his head, not answering, as thoughts of his older brother surfaced. "There are more than a couple of reasons why I'm not going back," he thought. "Asal is there, plus the Duke's wife is trying to kill me any chance she gets. Father doesn't do anything about that." As he walked quietly toward the academy gates, he thought to himself, "Going back to that place would be an act of suicide. I probably won't return until I graduate." While he was still lost in thought, Alice suddenly asked, "Are you good friends with Krantz?" Cyan immediately replied in a cold and displeased tone, "That can never be possible." Alice was utterly shocked. She didn't know the relationship between the two brothers, as she had been away from home for a long time. Confused, she exclaimed, "What do you mean?" Cyan turned to look directly into his sister's eyes, glaring as he answered coldly, "You know very well how he treated me. He's even tried to kill me once." Alice was stunned speechless. Brian, who had been silently walking behind them, finally spoke up, "I can testify to that." Alice turned to him, puzzled, and asked, "Who are you?" Cyan introduced, "My guardian knight, Brian Kendrick." Alice covered her mouth in surprise and exclaimed, "Oh, a guardian knight. I was wondering why he was following us. Brian didn't know what to say and just gave an awkward smile. Alice had been briefed by Cyan about all the things Krantz and his mother had done behind everyone's backs. She was utterly shocked now that she had learned about these events. She exclaimed, "That happened?" She was extremely confused and muttered, "I was in Frunia, totally unaware of all of it." Cyan glanced at his sister and calmly replied, "The bad guys are the Duke's wife and Krantz. It's not your fault." He suddenly noticed that Alice was seething with anger, her eyes glowing with fury. Even in silence, she emitted a murderous aura. She seemed to be contemplating something and did not respond to his words. Cyan gently called, "Alice?" She snapped out of her thoughts, realizing she had been silent for a bit too long. She sighed and then looked at Cyan, asking firmly, "Have you talked to anyone else about this?" He nonchalantly replied, "What's the point in talking about it? It's all in the past." As if it were a given, Krantz doesn't seem to be reflecting on his actions at all, Cyan began. But before he could finish speaking, Alice suddenly lunged and hugged him, catching him off guard. She was tearing up out of sympathy for her brother and whispered sadly, "You don't need to keep it in, Cyan. You can depend on me sometimes." She assured him, "I'll protect you from now on." Cyan only lowered his head without responding. Knowing his sister's future made her words feel heavy. Brian, who was also tearing up, was moved by the siblings' bond. Alice quickly stood up, patted her brother's shoulder, and advised, "I would like to stay with you longer, but I have to go somewhere. Take care of yourself while I'm gone." Brian was startled as Alice suddenly hugged him. His face turned red immediately, and he stammered, Miss. But Alice, unfazed, smiled and said, "Take good care of little Cyan, okay?" Brian glanced at Cyan, who glared back at him with a murderous look, making a threatening gesture of running a finger across his throat. Brian, terrified, cried inwardly, "I didn't do anything, though." The sunset gradually descended, and it was time for Cyan to bid farewell to Alice. He watched his sister's departing figure and smiled, thinking, "It's been a while since I saw her look so angry." He still remembered Alice's face filled with extreme anger because of him. Her appearance reminded Cyan of an incident from his past life, when he was young, back at the Vert estate. His older brother, Krantz, forced him to practice sword fighting, which was just an excuse for Krantz to bully him. At that time, Cyan was still a weak and timid child with no combat skills, so he was completely overwhelmed by Krantz. Krantz struck him down and arrogantly slung his sword over his shoulder, mockingly laughing, "What, are you already done?" He was incredibly arrogant and delighted in Cyan's miserable state, taunting him further, "Get up, you orphan." Back then, Cyan was terrified by Krantz's threats and pleaded, "I asked you to stop. You won, so." But before Cyan could finish his sentence, Krantz lunged forward and struck him across the face, snarling, "Good God, you sure blabber a lot." Seeing that Cyan was completely unable to resist, Krantz continued to beat him mercilessly, feeling immensely thrilled as he did so. However, his actions were halted by Alice. She appeared just in time and shouted, "Stop, Krantz." He was utterly shocked to see his sister and anxiously called out, "Sister Alice." She furiously demanded, "What are you doing?" At that moment, she displayed the same anger she showed now. She sternly ordered, "Apologize right now, Krantz." Cyan was pleased as he recalled that moment. He returned to his dorm room, resting his chin in his hand, reminiscing with amusement, "I saw that face just once in my past life too. The Duke's household is going to be in an uproar pretty soon. She needs to know the truth about her family so that I can protect her from the miserable future." Cyan remembered Alice's fate in his past life. After she joined the Order of the White Knights, his sister had died on the battlefield, surrounded by a horde of monsters, her body left mangled. Just then, Brian entered with 2 letters in hand, announcing, "For you, young master." Cyan turned to look at the letters in Brian's hand and asked, "Where did you get these from?" Brian replied, "One's from the academy, and the other I got from some janitor." From the color of the envelopes alone, Cyan could guess who they were from. He ignored the letter from the janitor, taking the dull black envelope instead, responding, "Is that so? All right." Brian seemed surprised that Cyan didn't read the red envelope. He asked, confused, "Aren't you going to take this one?" Cyan replied indifferently, "It's probably from the palace." At this, Brian looked closely at the envelope and realized the seal on it, exclaiming, "You're right. It's got the imperial family seal on it." Kiram peeked out curiously, asking, "What is it?" Even Brian was very curious. "I wonder what they sent." Cyan, seemingly already knowing the contents, casually responded, "They hold a banquet around this time of the year." He opened the black envelope, which contained a mission card from the Mist Guild. Reading the request on the card quickly, he thought, the other one is an assassination order, to assassinate Drini and Nephilis. It was a pretty big incident that happened during the palace's banquet. He pondered, since he's the younger brother of the current empress, it came as quite a shocker too. Kiram, seeing his master deep in thought, asked directly, "Will you be going?" Cyan looked up at Kiram and replied, "Yeah, I have some business there." Receiving this mission made him immediately think of Sarika, grumbling to himself, "Now that I think about it, someone else was put on the mission in my past life. I guess our hall master likes me. It's annoying, though." Kiram looked through the red royal envelope and announced, "Oh, this is from Princess Erin." But Cyan seemed uninterested and responded indifferently, "Really?" Kiram seized the opportunity to tease, "I thought you were just a little kid, but I guess not. Oh my, you've got a love letter." He didn't bother arguing. Instead, he glanced at Kiram and recited, "Demonic sword restriction." Kiram was immediately pressed to the floor, groaning in frustration. Cyan turned to Brian and commanded, "Make preparations to go to the palace." Brian, startled, bowed in panic and responded, "Understood." At that moment, the door to the room opened, and little Nana emerged, sweetly calling out, "Papa, I'm hungry." Brian, shocked by her appearance, exclaimed, "Young master." Cyan irritably looked up and mumbled, "What's the matter?" He was taken aback to see Nana. The girl had grown significantly. She now looked almost like a young woman of Cyan's age. Seeing him turn to look, she rubbed her sleepy eyes in confusion. Cyan, still in disbelief, exclaimed, "She's grown even more." The very next day, Alice returned to the Vert family mansion. She stormed in, each step filled with anger. She pushed open the main door without any announcement, leaving the entire household taken aback by her sudden and unannounced return. The butler, startled, exclaimed, "Miss Alice, you're back?" Alice didn't bother responding to him. Her anger was palpable as she marched towards him and demanded, "Mother, where's the Duchess?" The lady of the house was leisurely reading a book in her room at the time. Startled by the commotion outside, she turned her head in worry. Alice barged into her room, causing her shock and confusion. The lady asked in a flustered tone, "Alice?" Sensing Alice's hostile attitude, she immediately felt a wave of panic. She forced a worried smile and asked, "It's been so long. How have you been, daughter?" Alice didn't reply. Instead, she raised her hand and delivered a resounding slap to the lady, channeling all her pent-up resentment into that single blow. Thank you all for watching our video today. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing to our channel and turning on notifications so you won't miss any future uploads.